Bomberan, Bomberan,
Aid to the Contras.
Bomberan, Bomberan,
Aid to the Contras.
Bomberan, you know, bomb. Anyway, that old Beach Boys song, Bomberan, bomb. Anyway.
This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Is there a way that we can use these protests to benefit our geopolitical stance in the world?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to understand these protests are very different from the post-election protest in 2009, where many people believe Mahmoud Ahmadinejad won re-election by fraud. The protests back then were over who was going to run the regime. These protests about whether the regime survives or not, and that makes them much more threatening to the Ayatollahs, much more dangerous, and raises the stakes considerably. I think President Trump has already signaled a huge difference from the Obama administration by supporting the protesters, but I think we need to do more. We do not want to make the same mistake that America made before in 1956, calling opposition out in Hungary and standing by watching while Soviet tanks crushed the opposition. After defeating Saddam Hussein in 1991, we called for that regime to be overthrown and stood by where Saddam massacred other Iraqis.
Right.
So I think we do need to provide assistance. I think we can do it in several ways. Number one, this is yet another reason why the president should get out of the nuclear deal with Iran, should resume all of our previous sanctions, putting increased economic pressure on the regime. We should provide material, financial support to the opposition if they desire it. We should work with intelligence services from other countries, Saudi, Israel, to provide more pressure. There's a lot we can do, and we should do it. Our goal should be regime change in Iran.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
After years of grueling negotiations, Washington is threatening to sink the Iran nuclear deal. With the White House taking a more aggressive stance and Iran defiantly testing new ballistic missiles, is the thaw between the US and Iran over? Can the hard-fought nuclear agreement survive the spike in tensions? And should the Middle East brace itself for yet another war?
Professor, right after taking office, Trump's administration imposed new sanctions against Iran for ballistic missile tests and put it on notice for destabilizing behavior in the Middle East. Is American-Iranian detente over?
I don't believe so. I would not really judge Trump's Iran policy based on one sanctions they imposed on because of the missile issue. It is for 38 years continuously the U.S. in every administration, Republican or Democrats, they have sanctioned Iran, pressured Iran to isolate Iran.
Hello, I'm Dr. Pachenik, and I want to talk a little bit about Iran. I have been a serious critic of Obama and John Kerry. But one of the things that they have done that I thought was outstanding was the peace treaty with Iran. And the reason for that is very simple. For decades, and I've been involved with Iran for over 50 years, I've always wanted Iran to have a major position in the Middle East, as it has centuries ago when it was considered Persia. Iran is an old culture, one of the oldest cultures that we know. It's Persian, it's Zoroastrian, and it protects Jews, Christians, and Baha'is. I'm against war with Iran, and I'm particularly against the fact that Israel is trying to provoke a war to make sure that America is its ally against Iran. There is really no enemy in Iran. Let me speak a little bit about what I know about Iran and why Iran has always been the fall boy for our CIA. When Mossadegh was the prime minister of Iran in the 1950s, our CIA ordered Roosevelt and Schwarzkopf, the father of the Schwarzkopf, General Schwarzkopf, to come in and overthrow Mossadegh at the insistence of Prime Minister Churchill. Churchill maintained that Mossadegh, who nationalized all the oil wells and the oil companies in Iran, threw out the British petroleum oil, Aramco, or American oil, because they wanted to have their own oil company. Instead, we overthrew Mossadegh and we put in a very ineffectual, bombastic man by the name of the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was nothing more than a figurehead for the CIA and really was the son of a stable boy who was placed in the 1930s by British intelligence. So Iran has always been in play among the following nations: Britain, Russia, and the United States, primarily for its oil and primarily for its geopolitical concerns. I got involved with Iran in the 1970s when the Iranians took over the hostages and I had to negotiate with Ayatollah Khomeini. I had a lot of respect for Ayatollah Khomeini. I knew who he was. I understood that he was concerned about the safety of our hostages, but at the same time, he wanted to make his presence known that the Islamic fundamentalists had taken over a corrupt regime. I then was ordered by Jimmy Carter to fly to Iran and meet with Khomeini personally. I resigned, I refused, I said that was an incompetent order, and I suggested that the Iran hostage siege would continue for weeks, if not months. I did not know it would continue for years. The truth of the matter was that our CIA station chief and eventually our ambassador Helms had created a problem in Iran and a problem in the United States. We had 400 Foreign Service officers, American CIA, and other operatives in Iran, of whom only 8 spoke Farsi. So from the very beginning, in the 1950s to the 1970s, we were really maladroit at being able to hand a Persian country which was not Arabic, and that's important to understand. Persia is a country which is not Arab and does not like the Arabs, and it has a history of fighting Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries alongside the United States and alongside Israel, alongside many other allies. What subsequently happened was that Israel began to get involved in Iran for the simple reason that in Iran there were over 100,000 Persian Jews. Now, they've been there for centuries. I witnessed them, I saw them, I was there with them in Isfahan, and I was very impressed how the Iranians take care of the Jews, of the Armenians, of the Catholics, and the Christians. No one was persecuted. In turn, the Israelis felt that they had to have strategic tension in the Middle East. And what they did at that time was to create the Iran-Iraq War. Alongside the neocons, and particularly Zalmay Khalilzad under Secretary of State George Shultz, we created the Iran-Iraq War. And working with Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was then criticizing Israel and condemning Israel as a Zionist state, the Israelis nevertheless went in alongside Khomeini, sold him $500 million worth of armaments, tanks, heavy equipment in return for $500 million worth of oils. So the fact the rhetoric was severe, the Israelis had no problem making money from that situation and creating an increased strategic tension with Iraq. And of course, who supported Iraq? We, the United States. So as the Israelis flew the Phantom planes in the air on behalf of the Iranians, we flew the Iraqi planes, and in effect, it was just a kabuki with no consequence. On the ground, however, there was a serious consequence. Because of the work of the neocon and Zalmay Khalilzad and other warmongers who'd never been at war, there were over 1 million people who were killed. When I went to Iran years ago, I was very saddened to see how the killing field really existed as a result of American intervention, Israeli manipulation, and Iranian gusto. Now, what happened subsequently to that? The Israelis came back and started to supply Iran with oil, agricultural supplies, and started to build up Iran even in 2005, 2006. All along, they would create this notion that Iran, along with Hamas, who Israeli created in 1988 when I was on the West Bank, that's correct, Hamas was created by Israel as a counterforce to Hezbollah, which was Shiite and represented Iran's interest in the Middle East. The Israelis created Hamas in order to create a strategic tension and a constant state of tension where the Israelis could be in battle form and have armaments to use, to ship, and to deliver overseas. So Israel was not this disingenuous little actor who, was looking for peace all over the world. All the time, Israel was playing behind our back, and at the same time using our relationship with Iran as a focal point to make sure that we were always invested in the Middle East, when in fact we had very little national security interest in the Middle East other than oil. But the oil came primarily from Saudi Arabia, it came from Dubai, Qatar, other areas. Rex Tillerson knows this far better than I do. And in order to stop all of this, the Israelis went on and started to provide the Egyptians or the Chinese with missile systems. And the missile systems were then sold to Syria and then sold to Iran. So Israel claimed that the Iranians had missile systems, which of course I knew from having uncovered their track and trail as Australian operatives. These were Mossad operatives who went into China. I said, these are missile systems that you sold to Iran, and then you had counter forces to it. In effect, what Israel has done has become a very poor partner for the United States. It's one of the few countries that actually has killed Americans. In the 1960s, it was Israel that attacked the Liberty ship, knowing fully well it was an intelligence ship right off the borders of Egypt during the Sinai War, and it killed over 37 of our brave military officers and wounded over 131. They knew very well that this was an intelligence ship. They were not marked. They came in as a false flag, and they claimed that they had made a mistake. Well, that mistake was repeated once again on 9/11, when we had Mossad operatives who went into the Twin Towers, blew up both the Twin Towers, and 3 towers came down. So Israel was in a constant state of war, in a constant state of exacerbation of Middle East problems, so that the United States would stand by Israel in order to salvage it. Israel has always maintained that it could attack Iran, its nuclear positions, without any problem. That's that's a complete lie. Israel is totally incapable of attacking the underground nuclear power plants in Iran. It can do no damage, and it's not able to refuel. So what happened in return? In return, we had President Trump, who promised us that there would be peace and no more wars. Well, that went by the wayside. Instead, he sent an Orthodox Jew, Jared Kushner, to Israel to deal with other Jews who had no experience in the Middle East, to negotiate somewhat of a peace treaty with the Palestinians, and in the same time try to find peace with Iran.
These are the latest pictures of damage in Gaza City after a series of Israeli airstrikes. At least 2 men were killed in the attacks. Israeli aerial bombardment was in retaliation for several rockets fired into its territory. Our Middle East correspondent Derek Stoffel is tracking this story for us, and he joins us now from Jerusalem. So, Derek, what more can you tell us about this retaliation carried out by Israel?
Well, John, Israel's military, the Air Force, carried out strikes against 4 targets early this morning in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. The military says all of the targets belong to Hamas and included a military weapons storage depot and what they're calling a military compound in the area around Bet Lahia. Now, we do also know that a number of houses in the area in that neighborhood had suffered damage as well, and people had to flee those homes. Now, this came in response to the fact that there were 3 rockets fired yesterday from Gaza into Israel. Well, not all of them made it into Israel. One of the rockets fell short, landed in the Gaza Strip. A second projectile was shot down by the Israeli missile defense system. And the third did manage to hit Israeli territory. We believe it hit a road near the Israeli city of Sderot, which is very close to the Gaza border. Now, as for the strikes launched by the Israeli military, they left 2 men dead. And according to Palestinian officials, those 2 men belong to the armed wing of Hamas, and we do know that funerals were held today for those 2 men in the Gaza Strip.
Of course, Derek, all of this coming amid the anger over Washington's move, as we've been reporting all week, to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Further violence, though, in the other Palestinian territory, the West Bank. What can you tell us about that?
That's right. In Bethlehem and in Ramallah today, we have seen more clashes between mainly young Palestinian men who have been throwing rocks and in some cases Molotov cocktails at the Israeli security forces. They've been responding with tear gas and rubber bullets. Also, we're being told in some cases live fire. At the same time, we do know that there are some minor clashes here in Jerusalem today as well, with protesters facing off against security forces. In Jerusalem, they've been using officers on horses to try to push the crowds back. Now, this all sort of follows this days of rage that were called for by several Palestinian factions in response to the Trump declaration on Wednesday. Hamas actually went one step further and was calling for an intifada against Israel, but at this point, it doesn't seem like, the Palestinians have answered that call. We're seeing a different tact from the rival of Hamas. That's the Fatah party of the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. They're taking more of a diplomatic approach, turning to the United Nations. They were pushing for the Security Council meeting that we saw yesterday, and then later Palestinian officials will take their case to Cairo, where there is an emergency meeting of the Arab League that gets set to start a little bit later on today.